for space. Meanwhile, NASA is refusing to speculate on what may have triggered the explosion that transformed the Challenger into a ball of fire just over a minute after an apparently flawless launch. The head of the Texas State Teachers Association says Krista McAuliffe, one of 7 people aboard when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, will be remembered by her colleagues. He says that the aspirations of every teacher in America were riding with McAuliffe. A well-known author whose books include Space, a fictional view of man's exploration of the unknown, will appear live on the Action News Update tonight at 10. We will hear James Michener's account of space as he knows it. Please join us for all the day's news, sports, and weather on the Action News Update tonight at 10.
Just for the fun of it, just for the run of it, the number one of it, Diet Coke. Just for the style of it, just for the hope of it, the wrinkle, the taste of it, Diet Coke.
Spencer for Hire will not be seen tonight and will return next week.
The flags are at half-staff tonight here in the nation's capital and across the country. And this is why. The picture is now etched in our minds, but still horrifying. The disastrous end of the 25th Shuttle mission. The sudden death of 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, including the first teacher in space. Americans once again reaching for the stars, and this time, the first time, not making it. That is why the nation's flags are at half-staff tonight.
This is an ABC News special. The Shuttle, Disaster in Space. Reporting from Washington, here is Peter Jennings.
What we're going to try to do in the next hour is to put this national tragedy in some sort of context. The nation has lost 7 explorers. Ever since the manned space program began a quarter of a century ago with people like Alan Shepard and John Glenn, the astronauts, in one way or another, have seemed to belong to the nation. We do not know exactly what happened up there 10 miles above Cape Canaveral this morning, but we will talk to other astronauts about what might have gone wrong. We certainly know what happened here on Earth. The shock and the sorrow has been truly international in scope. And so we'll talk, besides to just plain folks, to politicians, including Senator Jake Garn, who's been on the shuttle, and to James Michener, who so effectively captured the space program in his book. But we're going to begin with those who, to say it again, we have all lost. Here's ABC Stone Phillips.
They were America's crew, men and women, veterans and first-timers, parents and even a classical pianist. They came from Akron and Detroit, Boston and the Carolinas. They were pilots and engineers and a teacher, and they were young. The oldest would have turned 47 in May. What they shared was a pioneer spirit, a passion for adventure, and a belief that man's discoveries in space can help solve problems on Earth. Their leader was Commander Dick Scobie, age 46, making his 2nd journey into space. He became an astronaut in 1979 after 22 years in the Air Force. He saw combat duty in Vietnam, won the Flying Cross and Distinguished Air Medal, and later, as a test pilot, logged more than 5,300 hours in dozens of experimental aircraft. Born and raised in Washington State, Scobie is survived by his wife June and 2 children. A few months ago, he returned to his high school to share his enthusiasm for space.
He really wanted to interact with the kids. It was okay to talk to the adults, but his whole purpose of coming back was to deal with the kids and maybe give them some sort of a message or a goal.
Second in command was pilot Michael Smith, a 40-year-old commander in the U.S. Navy on his first shuttle mission. Like Scobie, he had served as a pilot in Vietnam, been decorated, and gone on to train as a test pilot. He was selected as an astronaut in 1980. He was married and the father of 3, and close to Senator and former astronaut Jake Garn.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
39-year-old Ellison Onizuka was Hawaii's first astronaut. His hometown honored him with a traditional parade before he left for astronaut training. Onizuka was also a husband and father, seen here with his 2 girls. Before turning astronaut, he taught at the elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California, and as chief of engineering there, was responsible for all instrumental and flight testing modifications on highly experimental jet aircraft. For Onizuka, a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, the exploration of space was a way to serve man's more immediate needs.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
36-year-old Judy Resnick from Akron was on her 2nd mission. Her specialty, electrical engineering, her assignment to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm. On her 1st mission, she used the device successfully to help remove ice from the outside of the orbiter. It was also on that mission in 1984 when the shuttle Discovery aborted takeoff moments after the engines had been fired. Resnick later expressed confidence in the shuttle's safety systems.
After it all happened, we were all very grateful that the safety features do what they're supposed to do on the orbiter, and I think that the system has been designed such that anything that could present a problem will be taken care of by these safety features.
When Resnick wasn't flying, she sometimes doubled as a commentator, helping bring to life for television viewers what it was like to take off on board the shuttle. Gregory Jarvis, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board Challenger to conduct tests on the effect of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. NASA hoped his experiments would provide information for the design of liquid fuel rockets. He was born in Detroit and trained as an Air Force satellite engineer. He was married but had no children. Mission specialist Ronald McNair was doing research on lasers when he was selected to become an astronaut in 1978. Born in Lake City, South Carolina, schooled at MIT, he brought a background in physics to the shuttle program. This was his 2nd flight. A husband and father, McNair saw space travel as a calling for himself and mankind.
So I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore.
And finally, the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, chosen from more than 11,000 applicants for what she described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always ask my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher.
McAuliffe taught social studies in Concord, New Hampshire, and she said she wanted to bring the wonder of space to students all across the country. She'd planned to give lessons on weightlessness and life in outer space that were to be televised to millions of schoolrooms. She's survived by her husband, her 2 children, and all the students she taught and adored in Concord.
She did this to get people into the space program, you know, to open up people's eyes and get people more enthusiastic about it. And I know that she will hope that people take this as a bad accident, as bad accidents to occur, and just to have faith.
In the end, faith is what America's space program began and grew up with, that and technology. Today, whatever it was that went wrong, it wasn't a problem of faith. Stone Phillips, ABC News.
The 7 men and women who flew on Challenger this morning, in some cases having flown before, and reminding us, of course, that the success of the space program has been such over the last few years. This was the 10th mission of Challenger and the 25th of the shuttle program, that we have come to take its success and its safety very much for granted until today. I suppose the reminder there is that we now identify with those men and women in a much more personal way than we have done almost at any point since the beginning of the space shuttle program, with the exception of a woman flying for the first time, or in the case of the first black astronaut in space. You saw in Stone Phillips' report Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who said that today's accident was so devastating to him it was clear. Senator Garn is now at Andrews Air Force Base, having just got off the Vice President's aircraft, having flown to Cape Canaveral to talk to the people at Launch Control and clearly to talk to the families. Senator Garn, I think I know what the mood and the atmosphere was that you found down there, but would you tell us anyway?
Well, obviously it was very difficult. You always feel so inadequate. What do you say to people when they have lost their loved ones, and particularly where I was so personally involved and knew those that were killed today. But I was so impressed with Mrs. Scobie. She stood up and she said, "We want you to know, Mr. Vice President and Senators, and I'm sure I speak for all of the families, that we want the space program to go on. We don't want this tragic accident to slow it down or stop it." And she said, "We know that our loved ones would feel the same way." And so just a a very moving and touching experience.
Senator, you flew on the shuttle last April. You're an enormous supporter and very much a booster of the space program. What do you think today will do to America's program in space?
Well, obviously, we can't fly again until we determine the cause of this tragic accident. But once that has been determined, we make certain that it can't happen again, then the space program should continue. We have learned so much from space. It benefits all of God's children, every place on this earth. The basic research and development that goes on is so valuable to us, and that must continue. And I think we need to look at the fact that we flew 56 manned space missions, a remarkable safety record for this tragic accident today. So I hope that my colleagues will be smart enough to recognize the values of space flight, listen to Mrs. Scobie, and have the space program continue.
Senator, we have been thinking today about why this has been such a shock to the nation. Why do you think?
Probably because the space program has been so successful. John Glenn was with me today, and from his very first orbital flight, we have not lost a single American in space. And that is a remarkable record, and I suppose too many people have taken it for granted. They haven't realized that we are still in the infancy of space flight, that we still have a great deal further to go, just as in the beginning of general aviation after the Wright brothers. And so I guess they just expected never to have an accident. We just continue going on with our magnificent success record.
And Senator, there has been today the inevitable mini debate, I think we can say, about the value of man in space versus the value of sheer technology in space. Why should man go into space so constantly?
Why should man have explored the West? Why should the man have crossed oceans? There is a balance that we need in space. We have the Uranus mission out. We've done a lot of unmanned space programs. But you look at what man has been able to accomplish. You look at the work that has been done in space. You look at the experimentation on medicines for the future. You look at the repair, the retrieval of satellites in space. Man can do a great deal that machines can't do, and so you need a balance of the two. And we have had that, and that balance should continue, using robotics and using man.
Senator, I know this has been an extremely difficult day for you. I do have one last question. We were immensely frustrated waiting for NASA's briefing today and getting as little as we did. Do you think NASA will reach some kind of conclusion fairly quickly based on the data they have?
I would not expect a quick conclusion to this. There is so much information. There are hundreds of channels of telemetering data that comes back that has to be analyzed. They'll have to appoint a commission to study this. And I don't think they want any quick fixes. They want to know what happened and why and how to fix it. And that is the important thing, not speed in making that determination, to make sure we make a sound determination and sound recommendations.
Senator, you're very thoughtful to take the time for us when you've given so much time to the families today, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Jake Garn, senator from Utah, who flew on the shuttle last April, and who, as we said, and as you can clearly see, is an enormous booster of the continuation of the American manned space program. The senator raises the question of safety and delay. Back in 1967, when the astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee died when their spacecraft caught fire on the ground, it took 22 months before the space program was resumed, which will give you some indication of how long we might now have to wait before the manned space program, the shuttle program, continues. Challenger today had flown for just a little over a minute. When it left Cape Canaveral after something of a delay, it was a little after 11:30 in the morning. Let us go back now to recall that moment which much of the nation saw live and much of the nation shared in. The initial joy and the subsequent horror.
Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger.
As you can see on your screens there, it was 11:39 in the morning Eastern Standard Time after yet another delay, and Challenger's had a number of them, as has had Columbia. But it looked so perfect against the blue Atlantic sky as the rollover came.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%.
And those big additional booster rockets in the main engine rocketed Challenger towards its orbit,
65% shortly.
roughly approaching 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells.
There will be a phrase here that we shall all long remember. Listen to mission control, tell them what to do.
2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Go with throttle up. And then it happens.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And it occurred with such lightning speed as one of the booster rockets flies randomly off into space, and we look at it again in slow motion, that you may have noticed that the control commander, the launch control voice that we've become so familiar with on launches, was simply reading his telemetry, his information coming back, and was not aware, as so many people were when they saw it, even though they didn't understand it in space. Lynn Scher, who covers space for us on a full-time basis. Lynn, can you pick up from your base in California and tell us now what we're seeing?
Well, Peter, we've just gotten past, obviously, the critical moment. This is the fireball. This is the catastrophic explosion engulfing the Challenger and the solid rockets. And I think in just a moment, you will see the what we think there on the lower right of your screen appears to be Challenger's nose emerging from that big cloud, then falling into the ocean, our last view of Challenger. We have examined these tapes so many times, Peter, that we think we can at least try to pinpoint the sequence. At the right of your screen now, the solid rocket booster fizzling off into nowhere. Nowhere to go. It is controlled before launch, and it's meant, of course, to be attached to the shuttle and to the tank and to take them into orbit. But with that premature explosion, it has nowhere to go, and it's off into the ocean. And if I'm not mistaken, the next few frames will show us the crazy spinning of the 2 solid rocket boosters forming kind of an awkward Y-shaped as they each go off in kind of a cockeyed direction, obviously not where they're meant to be going at all. It looked to us, when we have screened this tape before, that the first flame appeared in between the external tank and the orbiter. Now, that's the plume on the left. That's a little bit of the gas fuel for the fire, just the liquid hydrogen and oxygen burning off. There is where we thought we saw the first sign of flame. Actually, I think it was a little bit before this. Maybe we can go back and find that. In any event, this is the flame that is now going to ride up the external tank in between the tank and the orbiter, both of them extremely thin-skinned on purpose for weight reasons. They're not meant to withstand this kind of explosion, and obviously when that liquid hydrogen and oxygen gets near that kind of heat, boom, it just went in an instant. And no one I have talked to here on Earth believes that it happened in any more time than just an instant. The astronauts, the shuttle, simply did not have a chance. And in other words, to not put too fine a point on it, they didn't know it hit them. Absolutely not. I know that you and everybody were talking very hopefully for a while that perhaps those parachutes indicated they had gotten out. There really does not appear to be any way. That shuttle is simply not designed for that kind of explosion. Now, of course, the problem is what really happened. We can look at the sequence. We can pinpoint where we see the flames. What NASA has to do is figure out why. Peter, we've been talking to a number of people. There are a number of theories, all of them speculation. Let me run down a few of them for you, if I may. One possibility, perhaps one of the 3 main engines simply let go, causing a problem that way. These engines had flown before, all 3 of them, one of them on 3 missions, one of them on 4 missions, the other on 4 missions. Perhaps something happened to an engine. Another possibility, perhaps there was a problem in the fuel line connecting the tank to the shuttle Challenger. Maybe something happened there. Another problem, perhaps it was one of the struts, one of the connectors holding that big tank onto the shuttle. Maybe that was the problem. Another possibility, a puncture in the tank. That tank, again, extremely thin-skinned, the orange tank. Maybe there was a hole, maybe there was a leak, who knows. The only other possibility, and I'm sure there are millions more, the only other possibility I've heard discussed was that one of those boosters, one of those white crayon-like structures on the side, those big Roman candles, perhaps went awry before it split off. Our evidence from the footage we've seen does not seem to indicate that. Again, we're not going to know until they do all the analysis. Well, Linda, those are, again, just some of the theories.
Well, I'm just saying, just by suggesting some of the theories, you've opened an endless range of possibilities. One of the people who's been tremendously helpful to us today joins us again now from Houston, Gene Cernan, the former Apollo astronaut, the last man to walk on the moon. Gene, you've seen the same tapes over and over again today. What do they tell you?
Well, Peter, you know, we can speculate, I guess, all day long, but it does appear that something, Lynn's ideas are certainly have potential, but it appears to me that whatever it was, it violated the integrity of that tank and allowed the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen in some capacity to mix. And hydrogen is a tremendous explosive, and in this case, we saw the results of what can happen when it's mixed with something like oxygen.
Well, Gene, let me offer, if I may, to you another theory, if I could get a look at this model here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but about a year ago, the whole process was lightened up to some extent. And there was some suggestion today, at least by some people, that these struts, and Lynn has alluded to it, these things which basically hold the Challenger on to this enormous gas tank, which is really what it is, may have not been able to stand the stress. Do you buy that theory at all?
Well, of course, that's always possible, but you know, the vehicle was designed to go through that area we've talked so much about today called maximum dynamic pressure. That's when, if you will, the speed of the aircraft and the density of the air create the greatest wind on the spacecraft during its ascent. It's designed specifically as for that point being a high stress point, where you get the greatest shaking, the greatest bending of the skins, the greatest flapping of the wings, if you want to go to exaggeration. That's a very critical point. It appears that this either occurred just subsequent to that point. There may have been a rupture as a result of that through fatigue or for some other reason.
Gene, there has been the obvious question asked today about an escape mechanism in a space capsule or something on board the shuttle. There was one on Columbia some time ago. Why not on Challenger?
Well, you know, the Columbia's first 4 flights, I think the crew, it was only a 2-man crew. They did have ejection seats. It was a test vehicle. If we go into history of the space program, no other manned spacecraft has been flown for the first time with a man aboard. They were all flown unmanned until we got to the space shuttle. We built ejection seats in so that the crew was able to make some decisions at different points of the mission had they needed to, had they had some inkling of a problem that was forthcoming. We decided when we put 5 and 6 and 7 people on and the shuttle became more operational, proved its capability, its reliability, that not only was there no need for those ejection seats, in a case like this, for instance, they would not have even done any good. There was an escape mechanism, and that was a shuttle itself. If the crew, if the ground had some idea that there was a problem occurring, a critical problem, even a couple moments ahead of time, they could have jettisoned that external tank, jettisoned those solid rockets, and although the maneuver is very complicated and difficult, landed back at Kennedy Space Center.
Gene, I'd like to point out, and I know that you know this too, of course they have that capability. As you well know, nobody really ever wanted to try that. A return to the launch site abort, which is the technical name for it, that emergency landing back at the Cape, they say they were prepared for it. They didn't really ever want to try it. And just to add to what you were saying about the ejection seats, Peter, you're quite right. There were ejection seats on Columbia. There are no longer. It has been modified to match Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis. And as Gene points out, there were only 2 ejection seats, and now there's 5, 6, and 7 passengers.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to get at here, because it has been raised today, and let me get a fairly brief answer from you, if I may, Gene. Was this a shortcut because we were putting additional personnel on the shuttle, or is this a reflection of how good NASA felt about the safety of the program in general?
No, the program was designed to follow this plan of attack. It was designed as a test article and a test vehicle initially to have those ejection seats. Subsequent to that, it was designed not to have them, and that was the plan. This was not a shortcut. It was just a planned and a long-term operation of this vehicle. You know, if I might refer to something Lynn said, she's absolutely right. Nobody ever wanted to make that abort and come back to landing site. A very difficult maneuver for the best aviator in the world. But we confronted those things a lot in the past. My last launch was a night launch. If everything failed and we had to abort during the same phase of the mission and we had to get off the launch vehicle, at nighttime I had to use STAR to be able to orient the vehicle so that we could head in the right direction and not burn up coming into the atmosphere. That's something I didn't want to do. but it's something we practice, and I think, indeed, I knew we could do it if we had to, and I believe that was the same in this particular case in every shuttle flight.
Gene, thank you very much for joining us. You've made a wonderful contribution today, and we're very grateful. You helped our understanding a lot. Gene Cernan, last man to set foot on the moon, one of the Apollo astronauts who has become, as we said at the beginning of this program, the nation's astronaut, one of those individuals who has been so touched. One of the things that people have said fairly regularly today is that we've become rather blasé about the success of the manned space program. On the other hand, people have tended to refer on more than one occasion to the way people chivied away at NASA because both Columbia and Challenger have spent additional time on the ground when they were supposed to be launched because of minor and sometimes not so minor problems. There's no question that both Columbia and Challenger's the issue here today, was something of a troubled spacecraft. Does not suggest by any means reflection on what happened today, but it was, on occasion, a troubled spacecraft. Here's John McWethy.
When they built this $1.5 billion spacecraft, they projected that it would be flying for at least a decade, part of a fleet of space shuttles that would be roaring into orbit every few weeks. Challenger was on its 10th flight today and just its 3rd year of service. Like its sister ships, Columbia, Discovery, and Atlantis, Challenger has suffered through some crippling technical problems over the years, but has also repeatedly written itself into the history books with its many successful firsts. It was aboard Challenger that Sally Ride, the first female astronaut, made her maiden voyage into space. Guyan Bluford became the first American black in space. His ship was Challenger. The spacecraft was used for the first spacewalk from a shuttle in 1983, and a year later it proved for the first time that shuttle could indeed capture a satellite, repair it, and send it back into orbit. But Challenger has also been shadowed by problems. Its first launch in 1983 was delayed for 2.5 months because of an engine leak. In one 1984 mission, the Challenger crew lost 3 satellites while trying to launch them into orbit. Malfunctions later blamed on the satellites, not on Challenger. In December of 1984, NASA had to scrub Challenger's next mission. It was supposed to carry the military's first secret payload into space. Challenger's protective heat shield had been badly damaged, and the ship had to go in for an extensive overhaul. Last July was probably Challenger's worst month until today. 3 seconds before its scheduled liftoff, the countdown was stopped because of a coolant leak.
We have an RSLS abort. We have an abort.
Later that same month, Challenger came perilously close to disaster when it suffered what NASA called a launch emergency. One of its engines shut down while the spacecraft was climbing into orbit. The crew scrambled to jettison excess weight, but they could never get Challenger up to its full orbit. Challenger was supposed to fly 5 missions this year. One of them was to be a secret military payload, taking it into orbit. The military, in fact, has been so concerned about the reliability of Challenger that it has insisted that NASA fly at least 2 military payloads a year the old-fashioned way atop expendable rockets. That was a hedge in case the Challenger and all of the other space shuttles proved that they could not do as promised. Peter?
John, thank you very much for joining us. In fact, on the 4 shuttles, there were 15 missions planned for 1986, both in the commercial field and the military field. This was to be a very ambitious year for the space shuttle. And as John McWethy points out, and as others have pointed out, this is an enormous setback, not only for the commercial competition, but also for the military program, which the United States had been using the shuttle for. In a sense, we'd like to put aside for a moment now the technical dilemmas for today of Challenger in this particular instance and the overall program, and talk about the human dimension, because as those of you all around the country must have felt, and we have been quite stunned, I must tell you, to hear and feel and sense the reaction from all around the world. It came from China, it came from the Soviet Union, Her Majesty the Queen in Britain, the National Parliament in Canada took a minute of silence. There was this quite incredible outpouring of sorrow and shock from around the world for the 7 individuals on board. To talk about them a little this evening, we've invited James Michener, the author, to come onto the program from Austin, Texas, because his book, to a great many Americans, captured the feeling and the sense of the people in the space program. Mr. Michener, thank you for joining us. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the people in the space program.
I received some criticism in my novel Space because the great effort that I focus on at the end ends in tragedy. It aborts on the moon, the 2 great heroes are left there, and one man is left with a sad job of bringing the ship back home. People said, why did you have to do that? Well, I had to do it because any man with common sense, looking at this great program of which I had been a part for many years, knew that the capacity for what happened today was always there. It could always have happened. As a matter of fact, it did happen right at the beginning with those three wonderful young men, Grissom, White, and Chafee. But the program went on. It was only 2 years after Chafee and his friends died in that tragic accident that men were walking on the moon. And I think that's the lesson of today, that we have lost 7 wonderful people, one of whom was a good friend of mine. This has hit me with terrible force, but only as an example of what we live with in almost everything we do. The capacity for tragedy is always there, right at the edge.
And the danger, of course, is always there for people who live on the edge. The people we've talked to today, Mr. Michener, have often been very closely identified in a professional way with the space program. Through your research, I know you've spent a great deal of time with these people. What is it about them that leads the rest of us to invest so much in them and often place so much of a burden on them as national heroes?
I think with great affection of many of the astronauts I've known, and I'd like to make one point clear tonight. I've talked with them for many hours, and I have never heard the word fear mentioned. They don't sit around and brood about what would happen if I get into this crate and something happens. They know what would happen. It's part of their lives. They've accepted that 15 years ago when they wanted to become a test pilot or wanted to become an astronaut. They live with fear constantly, but they do not let it dominate their lives. I have never heard an astronaut speak of fear, nor would I ever speak of fear to them. We were talking about machines. We were talking about procedures. We were talking about the inevitable chances that all men take. Theirs were more grievous, I think, than some. But these were young men, and I knew 2 of the women very well and loved them, really. They were just magnificent people. And we talked about the professional problems. We talked about the next flight. Always there was the knowledge that this was a very difficult profession they had gone into. There was a dignity about it. There was a wonder. There was a feeling that they were on the cutting edge of life, and they wouldn't have been anywhere else.
Mr. Michener, I detect, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that what you're saying in favor of the manned space program as opposed to the purely technological one as we've seen in Voyager 2 out in the heavens this week is the question of judgment and touch. Is that right?
If you read the latter part of my book, Space, you will see that I pay a great deal of attention to that great debate between manned and unmanned space effort. I personally came down in the book slightly in favor of the unmanned, of sending the great machines out to see what they could do, just as yesterday the machine at Uranus sent us back such a remarkable bit of information. However, I knew from the beginning that in the United States, the space program had to have men and women in it to focalize what we were doing, to epitomize what the space program meant for human beings. And so I subdued my scientific bent and said, okay, if we have to do it with men more than perhaps we should, that's the rules of this game. And I was willing to live with it. Tonight, I think you phrase it very well, Peter. I'm absolutely 50-50. I see the virtues of each. I think each is necessary, and I expect to see each move forward with great triumphs for the rest of this century.
Mr. Michener, thank you very much for joining us this evening from Austin, Texas, and making such, as always, a thoughtful contribution. James Michener, the author in Austin, Texas, making the point so many people have made today. It's one of the reasons we fly the flag at half-staff all over the nation. Here in the Capitol tonight, at the White House, and in small and large communities all over the country, because the adventure in space without man and without Americans is clearly incompatible with the national character. When we come back, we'll talk again to one of those astronauts, Deke Slayton. We'll also have some thoughts from George Will. We'll be back in just a moment.
After this message from your local stations.
The news today hit Washington like a thunderbolt. A number of us, reporters, were at the White House this morning waiting to see President Reagan, who usually on the morning of a State of the Union address calls in reporters from around the country, the networks and the newspapers and the wire services, to talk about his State of the Union message. And in the middle of that meeting, as we waited for the President to come into the dining room, a message was handed in the door to Don Regan, the Chief of Staff, saying, the shuttle has exploded, details to follow. We all fled from the room, obviously. And shortly thereafter, as some of you may know, the President canceled, postponed his State of the Union message, which will now be given a week from today. And the White House and Congress, but the White House particularly, has just felt the burden of this national tragedy very deeply. Here's our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
The flags went down to half-staff all over Washington as the shock set in, from the White House to Capitol Hill.
This is truly a national loss. Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
The House of Representatives paused for a moment of silent prayer, and elected officials tried to make sense of what had happened.
I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no.
God moves in mysterious ways, I guess from time to time to remind us of what mortal beings we really are, and that everything isn't all that sure.
The Washington day began on a note of pleasant expectation. The President would give his State of the Union message tonight, and his mood as he briefed congressional leaders on it was clearly upbeat.
Now that the Super Bowl is over, I can really say, welcome back. And Tip, I suspect the results were not all that you would have liked.
It was like the first year of your term, Mr.
But at 11:40, when the President received the news, the upbeat mood changed. Mr. Reagan watched the television replays horrified. He told reporters he was shocked and saddened, but that the State of the Union speech would go on. You can't stop governing the nation, he said. But within an hour, that had changed. The pictures were too horrible. The shocked reactions from families and school children too emotional.
The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred.
So the speech was postponed until next Tuesday night, leaving time for reflection and also the first assessments of the space program's future.
Well, it's going to have an adverse impact upon the whole space program. There may be delays that could go on for as much as a year with regard to future shuttle launches.
They were under tremendous pressure, especially in this very, very busy year. And I think that NASA was under pressure from its commercial customers to deliver and to deliver on time.
I think that some limit has to be placed on the PR that NASA indulges in before they proceed with their launch. I'm not opposed to an occasional civilian, but it seemed to me there ought to be some educational or some scientific purpose in their journey.
But at the White House, the President seemed to reflect the majority view of what's ahead.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
There'll be hearings on Capitol Hill next month as the Congress and the administration take a look at the space program in light of what happened today. They'll examine the timetable, the question of manned versus unmanned flight, among other things. But there seems to be no inclination in the Capitol tonight to give up. The space program will go on, as the president said, bloodied but unbowed. Peter?
Sam, we both know that the president has an incredible capacity to comfort the nation at times like this. I thought today he was as eloquent as I'd ever heard him. You tell me from your own perspective why you think this Capitol stopped so suddenly today.
Well, it stopped because it was shocked. It's never seen anything like this before. As many people have already said tonight on your broadcast, Peter, it had gone so well. The space program had gone so smoothly. People, except on one outlet, didn't even have the opportunity to watch the space program. The major commercial networks had not carried the launch for a long time. And so when it happened, it was like something that shouldn't have happened occurred. We're used to terrorism now. When the next word comes that another plane has been hijacked, we're all going to be horrified, but we will have expected that. No one expected this. And like human beings everywhere, they just came to a halt.
Sam Donaldson at the White House, thank you very much for a very long day. Joining us now from the Johnson Space Center is Deke Slayton. He's a former astronaut from Project Mercury. I must confess, Deke, that I can never think of you as anything other than Commander Slayton because I covered you during the Apollo-Soyuz when you linked up with the Soviets. You've heard that criticism from some members on Capitol Hill today. Too much PR, commercial pressure on the Apollo program, on the Shuttle program. What's your answer?
Well, I can't evaluate that, Peter. I don't think there's too much pressure. Obviously, NASA wants to get off on schedule, but I think the things that have happened have been good judgment. They've delayed when it made sense to delay. The problems they've had on the ground are the kind you want to have on the ground, and I don't think they've panicked into this flight. The PR part, obviously, NASA needs PR to keep their programs going, and this isn't the kind of PR you need, obviously, to have a successful program, but it's been said many other times this evening, that's the price you pay for progress, and we're just going to have to get our marbles back in the sack here and figure out what happened and get on with it.
Well, I don't want to be too callous about this, but even though this is an enormous tragedy for the nation, I'm very struck by how the nation's young people were engaged in this mission, largely because of Christa McAuliffe. In some respects, this may regenerate interest and support for the program, mightn't it?
I think that's very possible. I think people have gotten blasé. They've presumed that we're going to have 100% success always, and I think people have to recognize that every element of this program involves people, and there isn't any perfect people around this universe, unfortunately. So it's inevitable, as John Glenn said, it was going to happen. It was just a question of when. And I think maybe there is a message there, and the young folks are going to understand it, and hopefully it'll cause them to work harder, to study harder, and to do good work, as old Gus Grissom used to say, and make this thing work right.
Do you have any answers tonight, or any partial answers that NASA has not given us because it doesn't want to go public at the moment?
No, I don't. I, like everyone else, have observed the tapes a number of times, and my personal opinion, if I was forced to make one, would be that it's start looking somewhere around the engines, because most failures happen when something's in a transient stage. The engines were in a power-up stage from 65 to 104%, and that, to me, would be a likely place to look first, but that doesn't mean that there's any more than a 50-50 chance that's the real problem.
Lynn Scher in California has a question for you.
Deke, you were there during the other horrible NASA accident, the Apollo fire. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how long it took, not the program to get back on track, because we know the numbers involved with that, but what happens to your head when that happens to people you know and work with, and when you're slated to go up in a similar machine?
Well, as you know, Lynn, I was in charge of the crews at that time and sitting in the blockhouse, so it was kind of a personal blow. But like a lot of other mistakes and catastrophes, including this one, you hope to learn from it. And I think we learned a lot from that particular one. It's not only benefited the space program, but a lot of peripheral industries. Your airliners today are much safer because of that accident. We discovered we had flammable materials. We had a bad atmosphere to be working with. And we've taken advantage of that knowledge and spread it off across the total economy, and those are the kind of things you hope you get out of it. You don't want these kind of catastrophes to have happened in vain.
Can you give
You
us...
want it to be worthwhile.
Can you give us some sense of hard numbers? When Grissom, Chafee, and White were killed in that fire on the pad in '67, the program, as we said, was delayed by 22 months. And there is commercial pressure, and there is military pressure on the shuttle program. What does this do to that?
Oh, the pressure's still there, but I don't think anybody's doing anything stupid. They're going to have a highly qualified board to look into this thing properly. They'll try to find out what exactly happened. If they're lucky, they will. If they're unlucky, they won't, and they'll have to do a shotgun fix like we've done in the past, fix everything that might have caused the problem, and that'll obviously take longer. But I'm firmly convinced that we will find out what the problem was, it'll get fixed, and we'll continue on with the space program, and we'll all be smarter for it. And some things won't happen as fast as people had hoped they would yesterday, but they will happen.
Let me ask you a question that I suspect you do not want to answer, which is, what about from a strictly personal point of view? Is it a question of just getting back on the horse? How does one, as an astronaut, convince oneself to go back in a different machine?
Well, that's easy. I've been in this business about 45 years, and I've had people blowing off my wing and disposed of in other various unsavory ways, and you always get back in the cockpit and go. That's what we're paid for, and that's kind of the price of the ticket, to be up there and have fun and do things that are challenging and important. And I don't think any of us in the business look at it any other way.
Commander, or Deke, as many people do know you, I continue to know you as Commander, thank you for joining us this evening, and it is indeed worth pointing out that this catastrophe occurs after 24 successful missions of the Space Shuttle program, and while it raises the questions today of the viability of a manned program in space versus an unmanned program, you cannot help but get the impression that the overwhelming sentiment, both in the Congress and at the White House, and clearly with the people in the space program, that the manned space program can, will, and must go forward. Joining us tonight from our Washington bureau is ABC's commentator George Will. George, I know you have some thoughts on today and what it means in terms of both the world out there and the real world we live in.
Peter, this was to be the teacher's mission that combined something that Americans believe in very much, science, and the old simple schoolroom. It was to be an orbiting schoolroom. And in a terrible and cruel sense, it was just that. The nation today was taken abruptly and harshly back to school and taught a few things. The legacy of this mission, and those 7 people certainly did not die without a legacy, is a heightened, renewed appreciation of the terrific heroism of the people in the space program, who are dealing with very violent forces, with a very small margin of error, and doing it brilliantly. A recurring theme today, Peter, has been that the space program has become almost too good for its own good, in the sense that it's a bit like DiMaggio. He was such a graceful man, made so many things look so easy, that people began to not appreciate him anymore. People will now have a quickened sense of this. Congressman Brown said a minute ago he thought this was a setback for the program. I disagree. I think this will cruelly, at a terrible price, purchase for the space program the kind of appreciation that the country owes it. Furthermore, it teaches the country again the high price of progress. The history of progress, Peter, has been the progress of turning very risky things into very routine things. When we started to build in this country bridges and dams, a lot of bridges and dams fell down and a lot of people died. A lot of trains crashed and planes crashed until we got to be routine about flying across the country. This is a step, a costly step, in making something dangerous routine, and I think we shall.
George, I want to jog your memory a little because you haven't said it yet, but I know you wanted to say it. And that is the connection between these people who died in space today doing a job and other Americans doing a job all over the world tonight. So can I jog your memory on what you wanted to say?
You're quite right. Most of us, Peter, most of the time, live in blissful ignorance of what a small, elite, heroic group of Americans are doing for us night and day. As we speak, under the oceans, American submariners are doing something very dangerous. People will say, well, it can't be dangerous because there are no wrecks. Well, in the first place, we lost a submarine a few years ago. But more than that, the reason we don't have more accidents is that these are superb professionals. But the fact that they master the dangers does not mean the dangers aren't real. As we speak, Peter, somewhere around the world, young men are landing high-performance jet aircraft on the pitching decks of aircraft carriers at night. You can't pay people to do that. They do it out of love, of country, of adventure, of the challenge. We all benefit from it, and the very fact that we don't have to think about it tells you how superbly they're doing their job, living on the edge of danger, so the rest of us need not think about, let alone experience danger.
George, Will, thank you very much for joining us. Of all the things, I must tell you, a very personal observation that has struck me today, in all the phraseology that has been used about the heroism of the people in space, so far I think it's this line from James Michener in some respects, who said in all of the talk he had with all of the astronauts in the space program and the research for writing his novel, he never talked to them about fear. This also appears to have been one of those incidents which get so indelibly marked in people's imagination that they remember where they were, as so many of us remember where we were on the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, where we might not remember where we were on another catastrophic occasion. This was one of those days, and as we said at the beginning of the broadcast, this has affected the nation, all across the nation, in big towns and little towns, cities, villages. Everybody has shared in it, in part because so many of us saw it. Here's ABC's Bill Blakemore.
In classrooms around the country today, with someone from the classroom world lifting off, it was as if they all were.
What are you feeling? Oh, my God. What are you feeling? Goosebumps all over. Yeah.
James Rowley was a semi-finalist in NASA's Teacher in Space selection.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. My director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Can we get the cameras?
Brought in for the new age's first formal classroom lessons from outer space, our children were suddenly taught instead the old lessons of mortality. Of the real risk, which gives any victories their meaning.
Well, I was really amazed to see it because I never thought explosion would really ever happen.
I was pretty scared because I thought it could have been my science teacher that was going to be hurt in it.
A finalist in the teacher selection.
It's something that'll take a long time for people to get over, but I really feel that it's worth every effort to continue the space program.
Space shuttle explode, get it right now.
In the streets and stores across America today, that same feeling in the gut we had known before.
Well, I think it's very tragic. I think it's the most tragic thing since the death of Kennedy himself.
I got the same sick kind of feeling that I used to get when I was in Vietnam. Just a horrible feeling.
The feeling that you get, that cold feeling all over that only happens maybe 5 times in your lifetime.
We were all set up for it, watching this shuttle flight especially, because this time the space age was really going to begin. One of us was going, not just a teacher, but a mother, a private citizen, your neighbor.
That's very upset. After all that about Kristen McAuliffe, it's almost as if you know her.
Today, in the United States military and scientific communities which built the space program, the professionals tried to handle their losses.
Today, it's a very somber, grave-like situation here.
The NASA public affairs officer with us was in tears because he had worked with these people. And it is very close, and we're all feeling it. And I really find it very hard to talk about it.
People are kind of numb, just shocked.
One of the first, Chuck Yeager, who conquered the sound barrier.
You don't give an awful lot of thought to it because, number one, you can't do anything about it when it happens.
And the newest, Purdue University students hoping to join the space effort.
Oh, hey, there are risks involved, and being an astronaut is not this little dream. It's a job, and it has risks, and there are dangers involved.
A memorial flame was lit in the Los Angeles Olympic Stadium. Our national space effort lost innocence. The challengers learned of death. We will travel in space, but now none of us will take it for granted. Peter?
Bill, we mentioned earlier the eloquence of the president today, who is so vital to the nation on an occasion like this, as we see in Bill Blakemore's piece, someone who can somehow crystallize the emotion that so much of the nation is feeling. The president reminded us today that on this very date, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake, the first man to circumnavigate the globe, died when his ship was wrecked off the coast of Panama. An incredible jump in 390 years from circumnavigating the globe to searching for the heavens. There have been a great many words today. It seems that on occasions like this, a lot of the talk seems to have a cathartic effect on the nation as a whole. Some final thoughts now, perhaps, from ABC's Lynn Scher, who covers space for us and is in California tonight. Lynn?
Peter, I feel as if personally and professionally I have felt the absolute peak and the absolute depth of the American space program this week. The success, of course, of Voyager's trip to Uranus and the horror of Challenger's explosion. John Glenn said with sorrow that perhaps NASA isn't perfect. Well, perhaps if humans are meant to fly in space, perhaps NASA needs to be perfect. On the other hand, maybe that is simply the risk of confronting the future. In any event, the next few weeks, the next few months are going to be critical, not only in terms of America's space program, but in terms of the future of NASA itself.
Lynn, thank you very much for your stoic work today. Your mention of John Glenn, I guess, reminds us of the enduring quality that being an astronaut can have. Covering John Glenn in the presidential campaign. He doesn't like to hear this, I guess, but it's inevitable. Covering him, I think it was in a supermarket in Iowa, and people not recognizing him as a presidential candidate, as he would like them to do, but people rushing up to him, and in many cases bringing their children to him and saying, we named this child, this boy child, after you, John Glenn, because you were the first man to completely circle the globe. And it stays with them always. Let us remember this is a human tragedy as we think of the 7 people on board the Challenger shuttle again today. As you look at them from left to right across the top of your screen, Greg Jarvis, the payload specialist, 41 years old. He had been conducting tests on the effects of weightlessness on fluids. Francis Scobie, or Dick Scobie, the commander. He'd flown jet fighters in Vietnam. Michael Smith, his co-pilot, the shuttle pilot, his first mission on the shuttle. Ronald McNair, mission specialist from MIT, his second shuttle mission. Judith Resnick, one of the 2 women on board, the concert pianist as well as the engineer. Ellison Onizuka, the Hawaiian, who always took the macadamia nuts down to Cape Canaveral to keep his fellow astronauts happy. And on Teacher's Day, teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, a woman who was clearly the star of this particular mission and whose very presence on this mission had so engaged a new generation. We invested a large part of our national psyche in the space program. It is a catastrophe. It will surely set the program back, but America will stay in space. That's where America belongs. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us. I hope you'll stay tuned for Nightline later with Ted Koppel as we and the nation continue to discuss this tragedy that has really befallen the nation. Good night.
The Shuttle, Disaster in Space, has been a presentation of ABC News.
Tonight on Night. Good morning. This is Shuttle Launch Control at T-minus 3 hours and holding. The countdown of launching Mission 51L is proceeding smoothly. Liftoff time has been moved and is tentatively planned for 10:38 a.m. Eastern. The crew is still sleeping at this time. They'll be awakened in just a short while at 6:20 a.m., and they will then have breakfast and don their flight clothing. Departure for the pad B, is scheduled for about 10 minutes of 8. Here we see the 51L crew enjoying breakfast. Mission Specialist Ellison Onizuka sitting beside teacher in space participant Krista McAuliffe. And they are posing for their traditional shot during their breakfast. And then we have Commander Dick Scobie sitting beside pilot Mike Smith in front of the traditional cake featuring Halley's Comet and an apple for the teacher. Judy Resnick on the left, mission specialist, along with Ron McNair and payload specialist Greg Jarvis, all members of the 51L crew. The 51L launch countdown is on schedule and proceeding smoothly toward a launch today at 10:38 a.m. Eastern. The launch window for today extends until 12:38. This will be the first launch from Launch Pad B since it was last used during the Apollo program. Countdown clock is now at T-minus 3 hours and holding, and we're about 3 minutes away from resumption of the countdown. The 51L astronaut crew members are receiving a final weather briefing before preparing to depart for the launch pad at about 7:47. And here comes the flight crew now. Commander Dick Scobie, followed by Mission Specialist Judy Westwood, Ron McNair, and pilot Mike Smith, followed by Krista McCullough, feature in space, Ellison Onizuka, and payload specialist Greg Jarvis. Big smiles today. Confidently getting into the van.
And the first crew member, Commander Dick Scobie, now in the White Room, taking off his jacket, along with Mike Smith, who is the pilot. They're going to be going very fast today to get out of the cold and into the cabin. The countdown continuing very smoothly here at the Kennedy Space Center. While the crew members of 51L get ready and get in board the Orbiter Challenger. There have been many other things that have been happening while they have been on their way to the pad and out at the pad. Among those has been a check of the first motion system, which is a signal that starts the mission elapsed time counter both on board and at Houston. The countdown clock continuing at T-minus 1 hour, 17 minutes and counting. This is Shuttle Launch Control.
OTCO MTO.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're in workloads and a half now.
Copy that.
Launch of the 51L mission planned for 11:38. Everything going very well in the countdown. The weather cooperating not only here but at other sites. We go to Mission Control in Houston to check on readiness there.
This is Mission Control Houston at the T-minus 9 minute mark. The flight controllers have been on console here throughout the night, the early morning hours, and are ready to support launch. All orbiter systems continue to function normally, and Mission Control is ready for the launch this morning.
T-minus 3 minutes, 15 seconds. Aerosurface checks are complete, and aerosurfaces in launch configuration. Gimbal checks of the orbiter's main engines now underway. T-minus 3 minutes and counting. Gimbal checks now complete.
Let's go for ET-LO2 pressurization.
External tank liquid oxygen pressurization is started, and purging of the shuttle main engines is terminated. T-minus 2 minutes, 44 seconds and counting. Retraction is started of the gaseous oxygen vent hood. And the ground launch sequencer will make a final check to make sure the vent arm is fully retracted at T-minus 37 seconds.
OTCPLT, caution warning numbers cleared, no unexpected errors.
Copy.
T-minus 2 minutes and 20 seconds, and we've had the pilot, Mike Smith, has cleared the caution and memory system. No unexpected errors reported. Liquid oxygen ullage pressure checks are underway, and the liquid oxygen tank approaching flight pressure. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. The liquid hydrogen replenish has been terminated, and liquid hydrogen pressurization to flight level is underway. The vehicle is now isolated from all ground propellant and fluid loading equipment. T-minus 1 minute, 44 seconds and counting. Coming up on the 90-second point in our countdown. 90 seconds and counting. The 51L mission ready to go. The 51L mission ready to go. The liquid hydrogen tank now at flight pressure, and all 3 engines ready to go. Coming up on the 1 minute point in our countdown. T-minus 1 minute and counting. Sound suppression water system now armed. The hydrogen burn igniters have been armed, These igniters will be fired at T-minus 10 seconds to burn off any residual hydrogen gas. T-minus 45 seconds and counting. The solid rocket booster flight instrumentation recorders have gone into the record mode. Coming up on the 30-second point in our countdown. T-minus 30 seconds, and we've had a go for auto sequence start. The SRB hydraulic power units have started. T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point. Contingency procedures are in effect. We will report more as we have information available. Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field. You're advised as further information becomes available. This is Mission Control. Houston. We have no additional word at this time.
Carl, as I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch. As you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our number one priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program. And what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
It is with deep, heartfelt sorrow that I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
You get chills, you know, when you first hear about it. And, I don't know, you know, you start wondering why, you know, they're doing it and why they're going up so often and that type of stuff.
It hit me kind of hard. Everybody was shocked.
If I went silent, nobody spoke, just watched in stunned silence.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy.
They served our hopes for scientific exploration and for human progress.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God.
May your spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
Die. In that flash and fire, it will be reborn again, and other young men and young women who will read about them and learn.
The 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Engines beginning throttling down now. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
No downlink. No further communication from the space shuttle. Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. The death of Challenger and of 7 American pioneers.
Sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
The impact of today's tragedy on space exploration, on national security, and on all Americans. That's our story tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
We need help in discovering meaning in what happened today, and we hope that some of our guests will be able to provide it. Chuck Yeager, the prototype of the American test pilot. Ray Bradbury, whose visions of what lies beyond our world help prepare us for reality. We need help in coming to terms with the latest graphic television image. It has become as familiar as the other television images that mark a particular tragedy or near tragedy for us. The Kennedy images from Dallas and Los Angeles, Martin Luther King in Memphis, and President Reagan's brush with death here in Washington. And now the image of Challenger clinging like a moth to an orange silo, rolling slowly onto its back, and finally exploding into fire and graceful white tendrils of smoke. Television has served all day and will serve for some time yet to come as the national mechanism by which we begin to vent our grief and our curiosity all at once. It is also the mechanism by which our leaders try to point the rest of us toward the purpose in what today at least seems like such a tragic waste. As Nightline correspondent Jed Duval reports, the astronauts who died today were cut from a familiar and terribly important strip of cloth.
They were more than astronauts, of course, more than swashbucklers. They had the spirit of the seeker, the explorer, the one who wants to reach the edge of experience and have a look.
They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow.
They were part of us, chosen from among 230 million Americans, and they took us with them out there to the edges. Each one is part of a group of darers in history, those who went out looking, groping into the unknown.
Amelia Earhart did it herself, braving bad weather and a terrifying 3,000-foot drop when her aircraft iced up. Earhart became the first woman to solo across the Atlantic.
A generation before Judy Resnick, an aerial pioneer by the name of Amelia Earhart had flown across the Atlantic by herself and was trying to go around the world when she disappeared in 1937. Today, we can take flying for granted because there were Amelia Earharts. You can think of Ronald McNair as the same sort of darer as Maxie Anderson and Don Ida. They were 2 American balloonists killed in a balloon race in Germany 2.5 years ago. Anderson, who had ridden a balloon across the Atlantic, once said, "Maybe we're all crazy, but someone must do this."
Why do people do these things? For a buck? No, drug dealers do it for money. For fame? There are easier ways to that. Why have people always done it? For the wonder of it.
To go out there and look back at the blue planet. Or to go up, up, up a mountain. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine did that, went up Mount Everest, and died in the attempt, at the top or short of it. We'll never know. It was Mallory who said, when asked why climb Everest, because it is there. Challenger Commander Francis Dick Scobie would understand. Because it is there. They have that to share, you see. If not time and place, they share the spirit, the dare, and the wonder.
Spirit, bravery, and commitment are what make not only the space program, but all of life worthwhile. We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on.
Is not Mike Smith, Navy commander and the pilot of the Challenger, cut from the same cloth as the leaders of the expedition 400 years ago that brought the first English settlers to America? The very first ones, daring something, seeking something, who died at Roanoke Island, North Carolina's lost colony. Soon we'll know more about what killed the 7 today than has ever been discovered about what killed those early seekers. Without them and those who followed, history, and our lives, of course, would be very different. Colonel Onozuka was on his second space flight. He understood the exploring nature, understood why Robert Scott went looking for the South Pole. Scott and 4 others started out in late 1911, found the pole early the next year. Later, the bodies of all 5 were found with their diaries. Without the Robert Scotts, we wouldn't know there was a South Pole. Without Marie Curie, we wouldn't have X-rays. Did she know the chances when she worked with radium and eventually contracted leukemia? Did Krista McAuliffe know the chances? Did either woman think about those chances, or think instead about reaching, learning, edging forward? Gregory Jarvis was exploring too. He was to conduct the science tests aboard the spaceship. He and the others were reachers for something special. They had, in some ungenetic way, inherited a spirit that takes them over the land, over the sea, over the air. They lead, and we follow.
On this day 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete.
The old Navy hymn, Eternal Father, that mourns and salutes the seafarers, got a new verse after the birth of aerialists, the aviators. That verse goes, Lord, guard and guide the men who fly through the great spaces in the sky. Be with them always in the air, in darkening storms or sunlight fair. Oh, hear us when we lift our prayer for those in peril in the air. Jed Duval for Nightline from Washington.
Not that all our pioneers die in the attempt. When test pilot Chuck Yeager set out to break the sound barrier in October 1947, many thought his aircraft would explode. It didn't. And later, the World War II hero expanded the limits of flight even further, becoming the first person to fly at over 1,600 miles an hour, more than twice the speed of sound. General Yeager joins us now live from our affiliate KOVR in Sacramento, California. And in our Washington bureau, Senator Jake Garn of Utah, who last April was a crew member on Discovery in Shuttle Mission 16. Senator Garn was the first lawmaker to fly in space. But General Yeager, I want to start with you, and I hope you're going to be able to help us, as I suggested at the beginning of this program, understand what it is that motivates men like you and women like those who died today.
Well, Ted, I think one of the big things that myself, for instance, I had a duty to perform back in 1947 when I was flying the X-1. That was research flying, and I equate it a lot like combat flying. When you are sent into a war and you fly a mission, you don't give an awful lot of thought about the outcome. What you do, you weigh the rewards against the risk. And I think that same attitude follows right on into our space program. The guys and gals who were involved in the unfortunate accident today made an evaluation. They weighed the risk against the rewards that they were after. And that's the way I think all people look at this who are involved in it.
Now, you understand, those of us who are not involved with it, and a great many millions of Americans obviously are not personally involved, will have to see those risks as weighing a lot heavier than the rewards today. So help rectify that balance a little bit for us. Tell us about the rewards.
The rewards are the things that we find in space, and all of the research that goes on and has gone on for a long, long time, opening up new frontiers of aviation and space research. And the one thing, if you fly on a commercial airliner today, you accept it as very little risk. Yet people get killed on commercial airliners. And we are and will be faced with that same problem for a long time when you start fooling with high-tech equipment.
I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction. I thought you were going to say that because of the work that men and women like you and other test pilots have done, we are able to travel as comfortably and as securely on commercial planes today. I guess one of the questions that I have to ask you is, where do these flights, the kind of flight that went so awry today, where is that going to be taking us?
That will be taking us for many, many years into deep space research and development. The one thing that we're seeing happening today is the beginning of space exploration, and consequently, what's coming about within the next 30, 40 years, you'll see a great deal of commercialization in space, and you'll see many companies involved in space technology developing new systems, new products, and also opening up deep space to uncover what is on Mars, for instance, or what are some of the moons of yours really made of. And that's what we see coming out of this whole space program. And yes, it's unfortunate that we lost the shuttle today, but in my opinion, it won't have a long-term effect on our space program per se. It'll have an immediate effect on the shuttle because obviously we won't launch as many payloads as we had planned this year. But as far as long-term effect, I don't think it'll have any effect at all because we've had something like this or similar accidents prior to today's shuttle. But we always regroup, find out what caused them, fix it, and press on.
Senator Garn, you bridge that gap between those of us who have never flown or who look at it strictly from the ground and those who have. You've done both. You are a legislator. You are dealing with the reality of whether, in fact, manned flight now is going to be manned flight in space is going to be set back, is it?
Only very temporarily. First of all, we can't fly again until we do determine what the cause of the accident was and know how to fix it so that it doesn't happen again. But we can't stop. Ted, tonight I was with the Vice President down at Cape Canaveral. I met with the families in an extremely difficult time for them. Very hard to know what to say. You feel very inadequate. But Mrs. Scobie stood up before any of us said anything, and she said, Mr. Vice President, Senators, I want you to know that I'm speaking for all of the families. We don't want the space program stopped. We don't want it slowed down, despite the tragedy that we have so personally felt today. And she said, we know that our loved ones would feel that way. And she's right. I knew Mike Smith. I trained with him. He helped me for the first month of my training. I knew each one of them. It was a personal tragedy. But I can say the same thing. They would want us to go ahead. And General Yeager is being modest because what he said about commercial airliners today, because of great heroes of aviation like him. That's why we take commercial airline flying today for granted, because of people like him who push the frontiers. We'll see that happen in space. We're only at the beginning of space flight, like we were at the beginning of aviation when my father was a pilot in World War I. Everybody thought he was crazy when he was a pilot in 1917. And yet, because of those kind of pioneers, we all enjoy the benefits today. When I look at the spin-offs from the space program already, what we've learned in geography and geology, oceanography, volcanology, how we've improved navigation, how we've improved communications all over the world, as you find in TV and our telephones, what we've done in medicine, more than 12,000 medical devices and or procedures developed from space research. The pacemaker, Charlie Walker was the payload specialist I flew with. He was operating the electrophoresis machine, developing medications in zero gravity. You're going to find a cure for a major disease in space someday, and that'll justify every dime we've spent from the beginning of the space program. It's just unlimited what we're going to be able to do, and the space program must continue despite this terrible tragedy.
Senator Garn, you and General Yeager have well set the tone for us, but we've got a lot of very tough questions to address, and I hope answer in the course of this program. Please, gentlemen, both of you stay with us. Understandably, our focus tonight is on the loss of 7 brave people, but today's tragedy is going to set a lot of programs back and put a lot of schedules out of kilter. When we come back, we'll talk about those problems with former NASA official David Williamson. He says that losing at least one shuttle in some form of accident was a virtual certainty. And we'll be talking with Marcia Smith, who heads a national commission that's been looking at what our long-term goals in space ought to be.
1986 was scheduled to be the most ambitious year in shuttle history. 15 flights were planned, some just 3 weeks apart. Among the missions, in March, astronomers were to observe Halley's Comet from shuttle orbit. In May, a shuttle was to be tested as a launching base for interplanetary expeditions. A joint American-European mission was to study the sun. And in September, a billion-dollar telescope was to be released by a shuttle, which would allow scientists to see 7 times deeper into space than is possible from Earth. This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Sealy Posturepedic Mattress.
Former Assistant Administrator of NASA for Special Projects and a veteran of the U.S. space program. Joining us from our affiliate KSTP in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Marcia Smith, President of the American Astronautical Society and Executive Director of the National Commission on Space. The commission was organized to suggest long-term goals for the U.S. space program to the President and the Congress, and it is scheduled to make a formal report on March 1st. Mr. Williamson, you and I had the chance to speak a little bit earlier, and you said that it was statistically certain, or viewed as statistically certain, that one of these days what happened today would happen. Explain that, would you?
Back in '71, when we began really seriously building the space shuttle, one of the questions that obviously came to mind was how many do you build, and under what circumstances then do you have an attrition problem, that is to say, loss of the hardware. We were not in the Apollo program, we were in something quite new. We were trying to invent, essentially, a space airline, an operational thing. Operational devices have always, because of the amount of traffic, had difficulties at some point in their development cycle. Every airplane that flies has had its accidents. We knew that if we were going to build just a very few shuttles, they were going to have to be extraordinary devices, and we had to count on having one ground loop while landing, for example. Something happened during a launch that even if it just broke a little bit, it would be out of cycle for maybe, you know, a year, 2 years being repaired.
But you didn't get that. Why?
We kept running into what you might call the Washington problem. The Washington problem is, don't worry me with a problem that hasn't occurred yet. I'll give you enough money to do this year's bit. So we got enough money for 4 shuttles. We did not get enough for 5. We did not get enough for 6 or 7. We got enough for our first launch site, and we had to fight very long and hard to get the other launch sites finally built. In other words, going operational has been a long and tough fight.
Now,
we're not there yet.
I'm sorry to cut you short on this,
Sure.
but what does this mean then? Now, instead of having 4 shuttles, we have only 3. What is that going to mean to those missions that were set for this year? For March, for example, we were going to have this mission that was going to take a real close look at Halley's Comet, right?
Look at the history of accident investigations. They run weeks at least, and often months. You're not going to see a shuttle flight, in my opinion, until that's been well exercised, until we understand what there is to understand in the data. That says that you're at least pushing back the entire schedule, the entire shuttle schedule, by those numbers of months. Secondly, you're going to be trying to carry out a long-term national program with only 3/4 of the assets.
All right, let me turn to Ms. Smith for a moment now. And for example, the Halley's Comet mission. Halley's Comet is not going to come back again early just because we are inconvenienced. Does that mean
That's
that
right.
mission goes by the board?
Well, it certainly is going to be much more difficult. There were other observations planned using very high-flying aircraft and ground observations, but clearly the shuttle part of it, I think, is pretty much gone.
You have to report to Congress, to the President, March 1st. Are you still going to be able to do that? And what do you anticipate this incident is going to do to that report?
Well, our report had already slipped somewhat until early April. And in fact, I should mention that General Yeager is one of the 15 commissioners on the commission. It's a little too early right now to know what effect, if any, it will have on the commission's report, because we really were looking at the very long-term future, and most of our recommendations would not have taken effect until the 90s anyhow. But we were, of course, anticipating having a very healthy shuttle fleet of orbiters to do all the things between now and then that would make our goals realizable.
Now, General Yeager, some of the missions for the shuttle program were civilian missions, some were military missions. Now that the number of shuttles has been reduced by 25%, what does that do to the civilian missions? Because I would assume that the military ones take priority.
Well, yes, there will have to be a priority set, obviously, and what that priority will be will depend upon the present administration, and they seem to place an awful lot of emphasis on defense posture. And also, there's a lot of research that has to do with the so-called Star Wars concept that the shuttle was being used for. And I sort of agree with Marcia. It'll be a while before a decision or any type of reaction is made because of the unfortunate accident today, because it'll take quite some time before a preliminary report comes out of an accident investigation board, and we'll have to wait. But and you know, there's a lot of speculation going on, including amongst all of us here, and it'll be a while before any concrete findings come out of this thing and any decisions made.
All right, gentlemen, and Ms. Smith, we're going to come back to this subject, but I want to expand things a little bit further when we come back. In a recent article in Discover magazine, author and historian Alex Rowland suggested that the shuttle was a bad idea from the very beginning. Today's disaster, he now says, could end the program altogether. He'll join us live in a moment.
Well, another long-distance bill. A bill should be an important way for a business to collect information. But if it's an AT&T bill, it might only collect dust. Fortunately, there's the billing solution from GTE Sprint. Now you can break down spending by client, location, department, or individual. So you can put that information to work, not into storage. When you've got Sprint, you've got the future on the line.
Just last Friday on this program, we focused on the controversy over manned versus unmanned space exploration. Our next guest has no doubts on that question. Joining us live now in our Washington Bureau, Alex Rowland, former historian at NASA and currently a professor of the history of technology at Duke University. Did I overstate things? I saw you smile a little bit there.
Perhaps just a little bit. That is, I'm not...
State it in your own language.
All right. I'm not categorically opposed to manned space flight, but I am concerned that in our manned space activity to date, we haven't seen missions for the crews that have gone into space that justify the extra expense involved. And I think there are really two kinds of expense. One is the human expense that we've all paid today and watched the astronauts and their families pay. And the other, of course, is the economic expense, that it simply costs more to send people into space. And I'm of the persuasion that almost any mission we can identify to do in space, we can build a machine to do it.
Really?
Cheaper and less dangerously.
The kinds of things that we have seen those shuttle astronauts do, I mean, repairing satellites in space, you can't do that without man up there.
Quite right. You can't do that without a man up there. But for the $15-odd billion that we've spent developing the shuttle, plus the money that we've paid to subsidize it on its 25 flights, we could have built a lot of satellites to replace those that fail in orbit.
All right.
Additionally, I might add that we didn't need the shuttle to do that. That is, we were capable of going up and rendezvousing with satellites before we started the shuttle program.
But the fact of the matter is we have committed to manned flight. Therefore, there is a certain momentum that's underway, isn't there?
There surely is. And as a historian, I'm all for momentum, so I realize that we are not about to stop this program now, nor should we. And I think that we run a real risk at a dramatic moment like this in exaggerating the response on both sides. That is, I think several of the people who have already spoken are in a way circling the wagons and defending the program because it looks vulnerable now.
This is Jake Garn, and I definitely am defending the program. There's no doubt about it.
As one of the chief wagon masters. Go ahead, sir.
And I completely disagree with Mr. Rowland. I suggest he might spend a little more time with current NASA history than past NASA history, and he'd find out that you need a balance. The only way you're going to have a successful space program is to have a balance between robotics and man. There are many missions that are better done with an unmanned, an extra expendable launch vehicle, and there are others that are better done with man. And I think we've had a very good balance between the two. that balance will continue. I have ordered studies on the space station to force NASA to seek that balance so that it can be a man-tended station at times. At other times, it will operate totally by itself with robotics. We're very, very short-sighted if we don't do both.
Senator, let me bring Mr. Williamson in on this discussion because it fascinates me because the military has not been altogether enchanted with NASA's manned space missions, has it? And I'm wondering...
Ted, I hate to interrupt, but I happen to work on an agreement with NASA and the Air Force where, again, we have achieved some balance. The Air Force agreed to fly 8 missions per year on the shuttle, but we're also refurbishing 10 Titans plus some additionals in the background to provide for backup capability for the military on expendable launch vehicles.
Precisely because there was a certain amount of cynicism within the military about the capacity of NASA to carry out some of the missions that they wanted. Mr. Williamson, though, would you comment on that?
I'd like to make 2 points. One, speaking just to that military question, there's always going to be a slight sense of conflict between civilian objectives and military objectives. And the military, of course, want their own resources under their own control. And the shuttle is a civilian space program under civilian control, and as such is a little beyond their reach. Of course, it's going to be more questionable than their own resources. However, as Jake just pointed out, they are committed to using it. They've made enormous investments, both on the ground and in some of their space hardware, in order to be able to use it well. I'd like, though, to touch on the philosophical question that you were brushing up earlier, manned versus unmanned. If we look back at the last 25 years, not just the last 24 missions, what the space program has done, and the manned space program in particular, has been to change people's view of the Earth and of themselves. We are talking about something called hope, I think. If our entire hope really lies only in machinery, in space, without a manned component, a sense of real adventure as well as real accomplishment, and that far future, landing on other planets eventually in time, moving the human race out beyond our own initial little sphere here, then we really lose something if we ignore that aspect of it. And that is what the manned space program, at least symbolically, I think has fed very, very strongly, that sense of real endeavor for Americans, young Americans in particular, and for people around the world.
All right, let me use that as an opportunity to break. We still have a lot more to come in this broadcast. We haven't yet touched on a whole range of questions concerning man in space and the real heroics of venturing into the unknown. We'll be talking shortly with a man who spent his life writing and thinking about those subjects, science fiction writer Ray Bradbury. But first, when we come back, a look at some of the sights and sounds of today's tragedy at the Cape.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
So routine that on this 25th shuttle flight, the 3 major television networks were taping the liftoff from Cape Canaveral for later broadcast. They did not carry it live. NASA, which knows a thing or two about image making, had obviously put some thought into gaining broader public interest. Consider the crew. Among them, an aerospace engineer whose grandparents were Japanese immigrants, an unmarried Jewish woman who, in addition to her doctorate in electrical engineering, played classical piano, a black PhD in physics from MIT who also held a 5th-degree black belt in karate, and at President Reagan's request, an American high school teacher whose other primary qualifications were her vital interest in spaceflight and her courage. Those are just some of the crew members who set out this morning for what everyone thought would be another routine mission.
This is Shuttle Launch Control at T-minus 3 hours in holding. We're about 3 hours away from today's launch of Mission 51L and about 18 minutes away from picking up the count. And they are posing for their traditional shot during their breakfast. And here comes the flight crew now. Commander Dick Scobie, followed by Mission Specialist G. Resnick, Ron McNair, and pilot Mike Smith, followed by Krista McCullough, teacher in space, Ellison Onizuka, and payload specialist Greg Jarvis.
As they get ready, the teacher observer, Krista McAuliffe, has been handed an apple by the closeout crew. The 51L mission ready to go. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
A minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. The vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
Debris continued to fall for 50 minutes and more, and obviously you can't send aircraft and ships into an area where debris is falling, where they themselves may be endangered.
There are recovery forces in the general area, others being deployed, including aircraft and ships. We saw what we believe to be paramedics parachuting into the impact area.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray.
The Vice President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch.
It's a sad day. My heart goes out to Christy's husband and her children. An exciting day has turned into a very sad one.
It's a terrible disaster. And I remember thinking that in the early days of the space program, we used to sort of half expect something to go wrong, but these days we've become so used to it automatically working and computerized and everything that it's an even bigger shock.
Well, man, their monitoring systems on their injection into orbit. When it happened, they were caught by surprise, and even if they had been expecting it, they couldn't have done anything about it.
This is Mission Control, Houston. Flight controllers reviewing their data here in Mission Control. We will provide you with more information as it becomes available.
These searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties.
The President, in consultation with the leadership of Congress, has decided to postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening.
I'm reminded of when I was a boy in another age of flight and before the age of television, when I was gathered around a radio with my parents listening to the landing of the Hindenburg and then the resultant explosion and burning of that Hindenburg.
As long as man has the thirst for knowledge, we will continue to press outward. And in the process, there is risk. That risk is taken by each one of us every day, and that risk is understood by all the members of a crew that climb into a loaded spaceship.
I think that the NASA and the Congress will examine this question of whether we have not been premature in encouraging civilians to fly.
It's a surprise to me that it happened, but I would go again tomorrow. If NASA would let me go, I would go again.
And it has cleared the tower.
We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. were still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
Joining our other guests when we return, a man with a very special perspective on our triumphs and our tragedies in space, Ray Bradbury, one of America's most distinguished science fiction authors. He has been gazing at the stars much longer than most of us and with a great deal more vision than most of us. For 40 years, Ray Bradbury has been one of America's most highly acclaimed writers of science fiction, and he joins us now live from our Los Angeles bureau. And as always, Ray, you look far beyond today. So give us a taste of what it is you see as being the ultimate culmination of manned spaceflight.
Well, I was out at JPL on Saturday for the Uranus encounter, and on that day it was an exhilaration that reminded us that we were alive in a very strange and beautiful universe. Now, a day like today teaches us the reverse, that we are also capable of dying. And then we ask the reason for this. Why are we exhilarated one day and destroyed the next? And I was reminded of a thing that I saw on television some years ago when Carl Sagan was showing us the structure of DNA molecules and enzymes of all things. And I thought, just 2 days ago, I wrote an article about this, where the universe shouts at us, and the universe is the universal enzyme, and we are these massive molecules of DNA, and we respond. For secret reasons, we've come alive in the universe, and we love the gift of life. So on Saturday, we celebrated the fact that we lived, and today we discover that we have to die in order to go on celebrating.
Now, you spoke to me earlier this afternoon about the possibility of outer space providing us with an answer to the wars that we have been fighting. I'd love to be able to bring this program to some kind of a positive conclusion. We've brushed against so many different subjects. Go ahead, and then we'll go around among all our guests.
Well, yes, we've always needed to be tested. That we like to know that we are strong, that we are imaginative, that we have willpower. Toynbee, many years ago, in his various books, spoke of the challenge of the future rushing upon us and challenging us to survive. We survive in many ways. Too often in the past, we have survived by destroying one another. And the wars of the past have been futile and ridiculous to most of us. Now, all of a sudden, we discover we have a war worth fighting. In other words, in the long night of time, we humans on this Earth, in the middle of this universe, have a challenge. What is the challenge? Gravity, space, time, death, and darkness. Therefore, space travel has always meant to me our endeavor to fight the good fight, the best war, the one that's really worth winning, the positive war against time and death. And if we win that, with all the sacrifices that come with it, moving on out to the moon, to Mars, and then to Alpha Centauri someday, we will have won the supreme battle, and we'll go on living forever after that.
Now,
So
Marcia Smith, as you begin to prepare your report that goes to the President, that goes to Congress, is that a little bit too philosophical, a little bit too poetic, a little bit too far out, no pun intended?
Well, we are very philosophical and far out at the Commission, and I'm not quite sure how far out we're going to be in our ultimate report. I'm not sure how much what happened today is going to affect our report. I would like to respond, however, to something that Alex Rowland said and greatly take exception with what he said about machines being able to do everything that people can do. In the Soviet space program, they've already found out, for example, that the human eye looking down at an ocean sees very different things than a sensor looking down at an ocean. It can see patterns in the ways that the sensors can't see. Maybe someday we'll be able to build robot spacecraft that can exactly mimic what the human systems can do, but so far we don't have that capability.
All right, quickly, Mr. Rowland, a response from you. I want to give everyone just a chance to quickly round it off.
Surely. I'd like to remind everyone that we have designed a machine to go to Mars to perform the most subtle and most complicated of missions, that is, determine if there's life there. And we succeeded with the machine in sending it there, orbiting it, sending it down to the surface, collecting samples and testing for life. Any society that
didn't find that out.
Any society that can build a machine like that can build machines to do lots of the things our astronauts are doing in space. Not all of them, but lots of them. And I don't think we should engage that cost and the human risk any more than we have to.
General Yeager, you, for so many of us, personify the man in the cockpit, the man in the shuttle.
Well, Ted, I've seen a lot of programs come and go over my career as a military pilot, both in combat, research, and have watched the space program. I've seen many accidents very similar to what we have seen today. And a lot of people make a lot of comments, but it boils down, we find out what caused the accident, fix it, and press on. And there's a lot of people, fortunately, in this country who are aggressive enough to make these programs work. And that's the way it's going to be, in my opinion, from now on.
All right. I have really wanted more time to give so many guests a little more opportunity to say something more. I just hope you'll accept that I'm very grateful to each and every one of you for joining us here this evening. Every loved one left behind by those setting out for the unknown has felt it, a bittersweet mixture of pride and fear that simply won't go away until the voyage is over. And when we come back, we'll hear a poem written by the wife of an astronaut who journeyed to the moon. Somehow, in her words, she managed to capture that special feeling. And finally, a few words in behalf of those left behind, the wives, parents, husband, and children of the 7 astronauts who died today. There is a courage and a generosity of spirit required of those who stay behind that was captured in a poem written by Patricia Collins for her husband, Michael. Michael Collins was an astronaut who flew safely, as it turned out, aboard Gemini 10 and Apollo 11. Mrs. Collins titled her poem, "To a Husband Who Must Seek the Stars." In your eyes, the first glad token, as when first our love we proved, so your mind to mine has spoken, just as if your lips had moved. You are saying, yes, I know that the lure of space beguiles. You are pleading, let me go, not unwilling, but with smiles. Can you love me and still choose whispers that I cannot hear? Late to love, how can I bear to lose content for some inconstant sphere? Tell me how you see my role, to stay, to wait, yet yearn to go. Where is the comfort for my soul? You, my love, have helped me know. I'll be unafraid, undaunted, yes, of course. I need not face any peril or be haunted by the hazards you embrace. I could have sought by wit or wile your bright dream to dim, and yet, if I'd swayed you with a smile, my reward would be regret. So, for once, you shall not hear of the tears unbidden welling, or the nighttime stabs of fear. These, this time, are not for telling. Take my silence, though intended, fill it with the joy you feel. Take my courage, now pretended. You, my love, will make it real. I'll be back in a moment. Washington, for all of us here at ABC News, good night.